Hello everybody, so today we're going to be reading Amnesia, Ch.8-19 FEM listener up in here. I know it's been a hot minute since I've read this. I do apologize for the inconvenience. I got really sick and I could barely talk. It was really bad. But eventually my voice finally recovered and I am able to make videos for you guys again. Yay! So, without cutting this any further than it has to be, we are currently in chapter 8, but we're going to go back to chapter 7 for the purpose of the recap. So, for some context, before we really get deep dived into it, we are kind of like, we were like in the locker rooms with Maddie right before like a football game is supposed to be starting. And you are planning or wanting to hang out with, guess who? Toby. So we're currently in the locker room with our friend, just chit-chatting with her as she gets ready because she is a cheerleader for the football game. And they keep talking and whatnot, and apparently Wine was supposed to be at the game tonight, but she mentions like that she may not be there, la da 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 da. Maddie didn't seem too happy. Eventually she left. Eventually as Wine was walking down the hallway, her eyes fell on Toby. They talked. They got excited. They were like a little excited to see each other. They ended up leaving, went to this taco stand while talking and whatnot. And while all that is happening, Brad, after the game, Brad apparently, like, he was upset that YN was not there. His friends are like, why you have a stick up your ass? And then I guess he didn't tell them why. So that I'm guessing that's severely why, because YN wasn't at the game and instead hanging out with Ticci Toby. He's unaware of that little part though. And eventually they went to a taco place. Wine paid for both of them. They got good ass tacos to eat. Started raining. They ran back to Wine's car because Wine is the one with the license there. And she was cold. She ended up borrowing Ticci Toby's jacket because he offered it. And he quickly turned away because she was gonna start like changing into his jacket. She took off her top and everything and then put that jacket on. And I was like, damn. And then eventually they started cuddling up together to kind of get some warmth and whatnot. It was a little cute scene. I ain't gonna lie to you guys. I'm so sad I ended on this, but don't worry. We're gonna continue and find out what happens next, y'all. So, anyways, before we get fully into it, let's get to hear the warnings. Because y'all, there's gonna be some little shocking twists and turns that we just did not expect. Getting into these warnings, there will be mentions of violence, stressful situations, and really sad ones, fighting, abuse. This is gonna be falling more into physical abuse, heartbreak, fire, bullying and harassment, deaths, murder, and kidnapping. So, just to remind everyone, this is a creepypasta story. So, if y'all know what's gonna be happening, if you're into creepypasta or even know what it is about. So, these are just your little pre-warnings. Y'all, it's about to be a roller coaster up in here, but it's about to be a roller coaster, guys. Just letting y'all know. Prepare. Y'all have been warned. Chapter 8. Paper Corsage. Wyan ripped the ends of the lace from Maddie's corset and pulled. Maddie looked at herself in the mirror and huffed. Can you make it any tighter? Maddie asked, sucking in her stomach and standing straighter. Wyan sighed and yanked the lace again. Maddie exhaled heavily. putting her hands on her hips. Is that good? Wyan asked, tying the laces into a small bow. Maddie turned to the side and checked to see how thin it made her. It's fine, I guess. Maddie shrugged. Wyan rolled her eyes. You look great, she said it flatly, gesturing to Maddie's homecoming dress. Maddie said begrudgingly, waltzing over to her vanity to fix up her makeup. Wyan gazed at herself in the mirror, adjusting the waist of the dress. Maddie glanced at Wyan, looking her up and down almost judgingly. I thought you said you didn't even want to go to the homecoming. Maddie said, so who convinced you? Wyan's cheeks burned at the question she wasn't prepared to answer. Knowing Maddie, she should have thought of an excuse much sooner. Well, I'm going with Toby. She said this, shrinking a bit back as she waited for Maddie's reaction. Maddie's jaw dropped, and her eyes widened. She immediately stood up and put her hands on Wyan's shoulders. No. Please tell me that you're joking. Maddie shook her head, desperate for the confession to be a lie. You're not talking to Toby, right? Wyan's eyebrows furrowed. Don't call him that. Wyan said it sincerely. Maddie's face slowly became more baffled than before. Wyan, you can't go out with that weirdo, Maddie said, shaking her by the shoulders. Wyan grabbed Maddie's wrist and pulled her hands off. We're not even going out. He's my friend too, she said, taking an agitated step back. He's not weird. He's actually very sweet if you get to know him. Maddie scoffed. I can't believe you would stoop that low. Maddie laughed, crossing her arms. Would you ever, oh my God, excuse me, would you stop shit talking for about 5 seconds? Wyan snapped. Maddie's eyes widened, and her face drained of color. She rolled her eyes and grabbed her purse. Whatever, let's just go, she grumbled, walking out of the room. Wyan's eyebrows furrowed. She was beginning to regret her forgiveness towards Maddie. She checked the time. It was nearly 7 o'clock. Wyan eventually followed Maddie out of her room. She still needed to pick Toby up from his house. Maddie opened the passenger door of Wyan's car. Wyan's face contorted into a confused expression, and she waved her hand. Whoa, what are you doing? I thought you were going to get Jason. I thought you were going to get picked up by Jason, she said, tilting her head to the side. Jason said he was going to pick up his friend Andy, Maddie said, keeping her hand resting on the car door. Wyan rubbed the back of her neck before pointing to the back seat. Then you have to sit in the back, she said. I still have to go pick up Toby. Maddie groaned, slamming the car door shut and getting in the back. She couldn't believe Wyan would put Toby above her after everything she'd done for her. Wyan's lips pursed together, and she walked over to the driver's seat. A nervous feeling began to rise in her stomach. It was like butterflies, but instead of butterflies, there were hornets. Toby stood on the side of the road, occasionally glancing both directions for any signs of Wyan's car. He fiddled with a corsage he made from paper. He was still debating on whether he should give it to Wyan or just pitch the cheap thing. He spent all night making it, due to insomnia not letting him get a full 8 hours. Toby smoothed some of the wrinkles on his nice shirt with his hand. His mind started to fumble, with voices telling him she wouldn't actually come and that he was a fool for thinking she would. Just as Toby was about to give up and go back inside, he caught a glimpse of Wyan's car driving down the road. He let out a small sigh of relief, and the corners of his mouth flicked up into a small smile. Wyan pulled the car up to Toby and rolled down the window. Hurry and get in. We're going to be late. She gestured for him to get inside. Toby hid the corsage in his hands and hurried to open the door. He noticed the other girl in the back seat, who did not look happy, and he gave Wyan a weary look. Wyan waved it off and told him to get to sit in the seat. Toby took a deep breath and sat in the seat, shoving the paper corsage into his pocket. A deafening silence lingered in the car. Ooh, you never like when that happens. Ooh, that's like, ugh. Maddie glared at Toby before looking at Wyan. Toby couldn't feel more awkward than he did now. Maddie looked similar to Toby, but he had no clue what her name was. Looked familiar, to Toby, but he had no idea what her name was. Toby folded his hands in his lap, gently picking at the bandages on his hands. After a terribly quiet car ride, they made it to the school. It was almost dark out, but there were lights coming from inside, along with music that could be heard all the way from the outside of the building. Wine parked in a spot and pulled the keys from the ignition. Maddie immediately got out of the car as the coast stopped. "I'm going to go look for Jason," she said, pulling her bag over her shoulder. Wine nodded as Maddie shut the door, not looking back as she heard inside the school. Man, she was running for her life. She's like, I cannot be seen with these people, with these individuals. Toby's mind went blank. Wyan looked over to him with a slight chuckle. "Are you alright? I know Maddie isn't the nicest," Wyan said, unbuckling her seatbelt. "So that's her name, Maddie," Toby thought. He quickly looked away, realizing he was staring a little too long. "I'm okay," Toby replied softly, shaking his head and rubbing his eyes. His eyes trailed back up to Wyan. He just realized how nice she looked. Finally, right? Her hair was fixed nicely, and her dress complemented her eyes very well. He felt blood rush to his face, and butterflies danced in his stomach. "You look really nice," Toby muttered, nearly frozen as he glanced at her with sparkly eyes. Ryan's cheek turned a bit pink, and she let out a small bashful laugh. "Oh, thank you," she said, brushing the skirt of her dress down a bit. "You look really nice, too." Toby took a minute to soak up the situation before nodding. He felt the corsage in his pocket, but didn't have the courage to give it to her. He didn't want to slip up and make himself look stupid. Ryan looked at the keys in her hands before holding them out to Toby. "Could you hold on to these, since you have pockets?" she asked. "Of course," Toby responded. Toby took the keys happily and tucked them into his pocket. Ryan smiled and got out of the car. Toby followed right behind her, feeling giddy. He was finally getting a half-normal teenage experience instead of just sitting at home and doing nothing. They walked up to the front of the school and went inside. People were walking the halls in their dresses and tuxedos. Some Toby recognized. So he kept his head down a lot. Ryan gently grabbed his hand, causing him to jump a little. She brought him to the gymnasium. There you go, I said it right. Where there was a large crowd and loud music blaring over people's voices. Toby squinted at the bright, colorful lights that flashed around the gymnasium. Ryan said something, but he couldn't hear it. Regardless, a smile was plastered on his face. Maybe this wouldn't be too bad. Maddie huffed, looking around the hallways of the dimly lit school. Brad was hanging out with a few members of the basketball team. Maddie grimaced and took her bag, swinging it at Brad. "Fuck, what the hell's wrong with you, woman?" Brad shouted, swatting her purse away. "I thought you were going to ask Wyan out like you said you would," Maddie said, pointing a finger at Brad. A few of his friends looked at each other with amused looks on their faces. "It's too late now," Brad said, sounding annoyed. "She wouldn't have accepted it even if I paid her to." He retorted, "Well, guess what? She's out there with that Ticci Toby freak," Maddie said, pointing to the gym doors. Brad's eyebrows furrowed, and he shook his head in disbelief. "What?" He said this, pushing open one of the doors and looking inside. Sure enough, Wyan was dancing with Toby. Toby... That's fucking hilarious. Brad's cocky smile soon faded into an upset snarl. "How the hell did he manage to get with her?" Brad said loudly, shutting the door. A couple of Brad's group looked like they were going to laugh at the absurdity of the situation. "I don't know, Brad," Maddie said bitterly, crossing her arms. She was about to walk away in annoyance before her mind sparkled a thought. "You're still having an after party at your house, right?" Maddie said, pointing at him. Brad scoffed. "Yeah, my parents are on a business trip together. Why?" Brad shook his head, leaning back on the wall. Maddie smiled, adjusting her stance. "I think I have an idea." Eternity in her eyes. Maddie peered through the crowd of dancing people, trying to spot Wyan and Toby. She had explained the entire plan to Brad. Now all she had to do was get Wyan on board. Maddie squinted up in the bright lights, eventually spotting the back of Toby's head. She took a breath, bringing herself to a casual state of mind. She walked up to them, and before she said anything, Wyan noticed her. "Maddie, I thought you were going to go find Jason," Wyan said. Toby turned his attention away from Wyan and looked at Maddie. Maddie shook her head, tucking some hair behind her ear. "I couldn't find him." She responded with a subtle laugh, clenching her purse. She glanced at Toby before looking back to Wyan, leaning slightly closer so she could hear her over the loud music. "I'm sorry about our little argument earlier. I was just stressed because of Jason," Maddie lied, putting a hand on her chest with sincerity. "But I was thinking we could go to Brad's after party together." Wyan was contemplating Maddie's apology when she mentioned an after party. "Oh, I don't know about that. I'm sure I'll be drained by the time homecoming is over," Wyan said, tilting her head. Maddie sighed softly. "You can bring 'em." Maddie mentioned to Toby, who looked a bit shocked by the gesture. "I'm sure Brad wouldn't mind. He was usually too drunk to think straight anyway," Maddie said, waving it off. The thought of bringing Toby to a party that was full of his bullies sounded like a terrible idea. Just considering it made Wyan feel awful. Toby intently listened to her talk, taking in the feeling of being involved in something more than just the punchline of a joke. "Sorry, Maddie, but we're good," Wyan said, having more confidence this time. Maddie shrugged and tossed her hair over her shoulder. "Oh, well, that's okay. Have fun." Wyan watched as she walked away, turning her head to Toby. "Was she acting off to you?" Wyan questioned, resting a hand on her hip. "I don't know. I've never really talked to her," he responded, his shoulders slouching a bit as Maddie disappeared from sight. Wyan's eyebrows scrunched together, and she let out a sigh. Toby gulped, trying to think of something to say. "Maybe she's being nice," Toby said, the corner of his lips curled into a small smile. Wyan chuckled at Toby's remark. "Yeah, I'm sure," Wyan said sarcastically, shaking her head. Wyan looked over at Toby's shoulder, and she spotted Brad and his little group of jocks. Wyan started before grabbing Toby's hand. "Let's go somewhere else," she suggested, pulling him towards the exit of the gym. Toby's eyes widened as he was pulled in that direction. Wyan closed the door behind them and looked through the small window. Brad and his friends. They were talking to a group of girls, most likely underclassmen. Toby shot Wyan a confused look. "Why did we do that?" he asked. A group of idiots walked in. Wyan smirked. She checked to see if anyone else was in the hall before starting to run as fast as she could without tripping. "Wait!" Toby blurted before chasing close behind her. Wyan laughed and turned in a different direction. Toby soon caught up, and Wyan came to a slow stop. Toby came to a slow stop and looked at her, wondering why she would run all of a sudden. She smiled at him. Wyan smiled at him, trying to catch her breath. Toby smiled back. He soon realized how close their faces were. His face flushed beet red, and he froze. Their faces were less than a foot apart, and he couldn't help but dart his eyes to her lips. Toby felt the paper corsage in his pocket, stuffed next to her keys. He realized that he caught feelings, and he couldn't do anything to stop them. After a second of staring into Wyan's eyes, he cleared his throat and took a step back. "Sorry." He managed to quietly get out. He covered his mouth with one hand, forcing his gaze away from her. The few seconds he was near her felt like an eternity. Wyan tilted her head. "Sorry for what?" she asked, looking at him with a softened expression. Toby's heart fluttered, and he shifted his gaze to the floor. "Nothing," he whispered. "Let's just go to our spot." "What do you mean?" She said. "No," Brad said, his voice full of anger. Maddie rolled her eyes. "It's fine. I told you I have this under control," Maddie said, gesturing for him to calm down. "You said you would get her to come to the party," Brad said, staying loud enough to be heard over the speakers. "It's probably because Ticci bastard is holding her back," he said. Maddie shook her head. Hold her back? Without him, she wouldn't have even come here," Maddie said, flicking Brad's forehead. "I know she'll come because I was nice enough to invite Toby." Brad flinched back at the quick assault, putting one hand over his forehead with an ouch. "I told you to invite Wyan, not that freak," Brad said, his face red with frustration. Maddie huffed loudly. "You've got a thick skull, you know that?" she said, crossing her arms. I invited him because he follows her around like a lost puppy. He's going to think he actually has a chance with her. He's going to want to impress her, so he's going to prove he's brave by coming to your party." I get it now. Brad mumbled, thinking of what she said as he rubbed his forehead. My skull ain't that thick. Maddie groaned. You're so fucking stupid, she said under her breath. Brad shrugged and looked back at his friends, who were trying to hit on girls, none of whom Brad was interested in. So why are you doing this for me again? Brad asked, crossing his arms. It's not just for you. Maddie said plainly, I have to make sure she doesn't hang out with losers like Toby. Now, all we have to do is wait for him to come to the party. Maddie shrugged. Brad pulled out the keys from his back pocket and twirled them on his index finger. Then what are we waiting for? Let's get the party started. Chapter 10, Allergic to Empathy. Toby walked beside YN as they made their way down the hallway. He started to nervously pick at the bandages on his hands without thinking. He had come way too close to doing something he would regret. Now, he would have to act like it didn't bother him. YN peeked down the athletic hallway and smiled at Toby. The coast is clear, she said, waving him to come along. Toby followed after her, pushing aside the thoughts and feelings he had towards YN. Toby stood in front of the closet before opening the door and flipping the light inside. To Toby and YN's surprise, Andy and Jason had already occupied the closet. Andy was pressed against the wall, and Jason was holding on to Andy's hips. Both of their hair was messed up, and a few buttons on their shirts popped open. Toby and YN stood in surprise at what they had walked in on. Did we interrupt something? YN said, looking between the two. Both Jason and Andy went bright red, and Jason spoke up. You never saw this, Jason said, letting go of Andy's hips to point at Toby and YN. YN turned off the light in the room and shut the door, facing Toby. I'm going to be honest. I did not see that coming, YN said with a hint of playfulness in her voice. Toby nodded in agreement before smiling back. I guess we'll have to find a different place. Toby's head snapped to the side from a tick, making his neck pop uncomfortably. He rubbed the side of his neck with his hand and looked at YN, who wasn't bothered by the whole ordeal. We could just go back to my car. There isn't much else to do here anyway, YN said, walking away from the closet door. Toby trailed beside her as they made their way towards the exit door. Sure, he said softly, willing to do whatever she wanted. He pushed the door open for YN, letting her through first, then going out behind her. YN rubbed her arms and started to jog to the car to get out of the cold air. Toby ran behind her and picked her up, suspending her in the air. Toby! She laughed, trying to squirm her way out of his arms. Toby chuckled along with her, still having a tight grasp on her. He walked to the car with her in the air before setting her down on the driver's side. YN let out a huff of air before nudging Toby's arm. Jerk, she said it jokingly, opening the car door and getting inside. Toby went to his side and hopped in the car with a grin. A new, strange feeling grew inside of him. It was like a sense of belonging, almost like he was normal. Toby took the car keys from his pocket and set them in the cup holder. YN looked in the backseat and pulled out a hoodie Toby gave to her the other day. I'm glad I kept this in here, she said, pulling the hoodie over her head. Toby felt his face turn pink at the thought of her keeping his hoodie. Toby turned his head to the other way and rested his head against the car window. Toby's eyes slowly looked over to YN. She fixed the sleeves on her arms and started the car, hoping to get some warm air circulating. As YN was about to switch into the car and to drive, Toby spoke again. I have an idea where we should go. Okay, where? YN turned her attention to him. Toby bit his lip nervously. We could go to that after party. He said it quietly, as if expecting a harsh answer in return. YN leaned back in her seat. I don't know if that's a good idea, YN softly said in return, letting her hand rest on the steering wheel. I know, but we haven't got much to do tonight. We barely got to dance at homecoming. Toby muttered, staring at the dashboard. He still felt the burden of the corsage in his pocket. It almost felt even heavier than before. There's going to be so many people there, especially ones you don't like, YN said, switching the car to drive. Toby took a deep breath. I want to go to that party. Where is my guy you will regret very soon? Is everything ready? Maddie asked, looking through the blinds of the window to see groups of people getting ready to go home, to go inside. Yeah, I did everything you asked, Brad said, looking around the decorations and drinks that were set out. Maddie opened the front door, letting everyone inside. Just make sure you stay where I told you, Maddie said sternly, pointing to the kitchen. Brad nodded with a sigh, walking into the kitchen as he met up with a few friends. Within minutes, the house was turned into a full-blown chaotic party. Loud music blasted in the living room. People were dancing, smoking, talking, and drinking in every direction. Maddie stayed near the front of the house, keeping an eye out and making sure that Brad stayed where he was supposed to for this plan. She had to shove a few people away who were trying to distract her, which was something she was used to doing. After an hour of waiting, Maddie spotted Wyatt and Toby, and she gasped, hurrying to the kitchen. They're here, Maddie said, shoving Brad roughly. Brad caught himself on the counter, wide-eyed. What? Oh, what? He said this, perking in his up his posture. He had a half-empty plastic cup in his hand, looking at the door. Just stay here. I'll take care of the rest, Maddie said quickly, running back towards the front door and acting casual. Wyatt and Toby entered the house. Toby flinched at the volume of music and started talking. Wyatt extensively grabbed Toby's hand to lead him away from the loud crowd, but was stopped by Maddie. Oh my gosh, you guys actually came. Maddie smiled, sounding delightfully surprised. Yeah. Wyatt said in return. Maddie looked around before leaning close to Wyatt. Do you think you can help me find Jason? I haven't seen him all night. Maddie pouted, adjusting the strap on her chest. In reality, she didn't care about Jason at the moment, but she didn't know that. Maddie also didn't know that Jason had no interest in girls. I can't right now. Do you think there's any place that is quieter? Wyatt asked, talking over the blasting music. Maddie thought for a moment. Yeah, come on, she smiled, guiding them to an empty room in the back of the hallway. Toby sighed in relief as the stress began to fade away. Maddie turned to face Wyatt once more. Please, Wyatt, I really want to find him just this once, Maddie begged, clasping her hands together in a pleading motion. Wyatt rolled her eyes before looking back at Toby, who looked a bit awkward. Will you stay here? Wyatt asked quietly, letting go of Toby's wrist. He nodded and looked around the room, feeling out of his comfort zone. Maddie smiled widely and grabbed Wyatt's wrist, pulling her out of the room. Wyatt's eyes widened. I promise I'll be back, Wyatt said, stumbling down the hallway. Uh-oh. The door shut, and the room went silent except for a slight rumble of music that came from a different room. Toby looked around before finding himself in the corner of the room. He slowly slid down the corner, thinking with a pit in his stomach. I hope she'll be back soon. Each minute felt like an hour as he waited for Wyatt's return. He heard the door handle turn and the door pushed back open, but it wasn't Wyatt. Two strangers were making out as they barged in and landed on the bed. Toby's face went pale, and he got up, sprinting for the door and slamming it behind him. Toby realized that he was out in the open now, and his heart sank, realizing that it was a bad idea to come here in the first place. He decided on trying to find Wyatt instead of awkwardly waiting in the hallways. He started his search by walking into the kitchen. Maddie brought Wyatt around each room, looking through the hordes of people. I don't see him yet, Wyatt said, not exactly happy to be out in the open with a bunch of tipsy strangers. Maddie continued to pull her around until they ended up in the kitchen. Wyatt pulled her arm away from her. Maddie, he's not here, Wyatt said plainly, looking around and at the group of jocks. Maddie looked disappointed and looked beyond the doorway of the kitchen. Maddie gasped, Jason! She smiled and running out of the kitchen. Wyatt's face went shocked as she watched Maddie disappear into the crowd. She was about to chase after her when she felt a rough hand on her arm. Wyatt's head snapped to the person who touched her to see a familiar face. It was Brad. What do you want? Wyatt sneered, trying to pry his fingers off of her. His grip was like a vice as he pulled her closer. The smell of alcohol reeked from his mouth as he spoke inches from her face. I thought you were going to come here, Brad said, still holding onto her arm tightly. I didn't come here for you, Wyatt said, trying to pull. Oh, this is Santa sucks so hard. Trying to pull out his hand harder, only for it to tighten around her arm more. Are you sure about that, sweetie? I swear, these men. Ugh. Brad said, forcing Hawaiian closer and pulling her into a hot kiss that tasted like bitter alcohol. Y'all. Nah. Toby anxiously glanced around the hallway. As he left, a few people would shove him past him like he wasn't there, but he didn't care. He wanted to find Ryan and leave like they had what should have a long time ago. Ryan walked into around a group of people and decided to skip looking at the mass number of people in the living room. He went into the next room, the kitchen, and stood in the doorway. His eyes lit up as he saw YN, but the excitement quickly died down as he noticed her kissing Brad. No! His heart fell to the floor, shattering into 1,000 little shards. He took a step back, feeling his eyes sting with tears. A few people began to stare at Toby, just not realizing that he was here. Some of them even laughed. His chest tightened, and he felt a corsage in his pocket, pulling it out. Oh, wow. The paper petals were bent and ripped, making the flower misshapen. He bit his trembling lip as a tear ran down his cheek. And he turned around, running for the door. On his way out, he bumped into Maddie. Maddie turned around, looking confused. Oh, hey, it's just you. Maddie said, flashing her best fake smile. Toby held out the corsage and YN's car keys to her. Can you give these to YN, please? Toby whispered, feeling stupid and humiliated. Maddie nodded and took the keys and corsage. Of course. Maddie spoke carringly, tilting her head to the side. YN punched Brad in the stomach, causing him to hunch over and let go completely. YN felt disgusted and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. YN turned to be faced with Maddie. She jumped slightly at the quiet appearance. Before YN spoke, Maddie held out the keys and paper corsage in her hands. Toby wanted me to give these to you. Maddie said. YN took the keys and then the corsage. Where is he? YN asked. He left. YN gazed down at the corsage bent petals. It was her favorite color. The ribbon and the paper were beautiful. She looked down at the hoodie she wore, which belonged to Toby. Her shoulders drooped slightly in realization. Oh, Toby. Chapter 11. The Start of Fate. YN sketched notes into her textbook as the teacher spoke. The seat next to her remained empty. The boy who used to sit there hadn't been coming to school for months. YN hasn't seen Toby since homecoming night. The days were bland without him to keep her company. She had to hand around Maddie and her friends, acting like the shadow of Maddie's presence. Occasionally, YN would drive past Toby's house just to see that the lights were off and no one was home. She feared that he had moved without telling her, or that he simply disappeared. People have started calling YN and Brad's high school sweethearts. YN denied it every time, but the rumor spread like wildfire. Even her parents encouraged the relationship, making her hate Brad with a burning passion. The bell rang for class to be over, and YN gathered her things. She was about to leave without a second thought, but her eye caught on to something. Toby's desk had a symbol carved into it, a circle with a big X right through the center. Under the symbol were initials. She hadn't noticed that before, so she had a closer look. The initials were T-E-R. Tobias something Rogers. I don't remember. She tilted her head, running her fingers against the carving. She had never seen that symbol before. How strange. YN held her belongings close to her and walked out, trying to think of any special significance that was etched into the table. Her train of thought was soon torn by the loud, annoying voice of Brad. Hey, sweet stuff, he chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. YN groaned in disgust and pushed him away. I told you to buzz off 3 times this week, Brad, YN said, walking towards the cafeteria. Why do you try? Because I know I have a chance, Brad said, sticking his hands into his jean pockets. Sorry to burst your bubble, but you don't, YN said. YN realized she forgot to stop by her locker because of Brad's distraction. She narrowed her eyes at him, holding back vulgar language towards Brad. Maddie walked up to the table, setting her purse down. She had a look of frustration in her expression. Jason hasn't been answering my texts recently. Maddie complained. Wine didn't bat an eye at her. She was too focused on trying to get Brad to leave her alone for once. Maddie looked between Wine and Brad. "What's up with you guys?" Maddie asked. "He won't leave me alone," Wine shouted, gesturing towards Brad. The volume of her voice started to draw attention from the people eating around them. Whoa, no need to overreact, princess. Ugh. Brad said as a smirk crept onto his face. That was the last straw. Wine snatched her textbook off of the table and swung it full force into Brad's stomach. Brad let out a loud grunt before falling to his knees on the floor. Colors washed away from Maddie's face, turning her pale as she watched him collapse. She was stricken speechless by what Wine did. Wine didn't care one bit. She picked up her things and stormed out of the cafeteria. She felt tears sting her eyes, and soon tears slid down her face, but she didn't know why. Her walk turned into a run as she ran down the hallway. She could hear steps running after her, but yet she paid no mind to it. She ran to the athletic closet and opened the heavy door, shutting it and locking it behind her. Wine heard Brad's voice calling for her to come out. She sat in the corner of the room, setting her books beside her. Brad's words were soon drowned out by her quiet sobs. Wine cried out of worry and grief over the unknown. She missed Toby's soft voice and kind manner. She missed the way he acted so sweet, even though everyone was nothing but mean to him. She wiped her eyes with her palms. Her breath stuttered as she tried to regain her composure. After all these weeks, she couldn't help but wonder where he was. Toby sat on the couch, flipping through TV channels. The days blurred by ever since he was transferred to homeschooling. He did the same thing each day, and he was nearly sick of it. Toby was the only one home. The house was quiet, so he kept out the lights to make it easier on his eyes. He sighed and leaned back on the couch. His mind circled around Wyan 1,000 times, each time brought back to the painful memory of the party, making him feel sick to his stomach. He rubbed his eyes and tried to push the thoughts of her away, but they stuck. She had done so much for him, making him feel guilty for ghosting her without a word. He got to feel normal for a while, and now it was back to his normal loneliness. Toby looked outside. The sun was nearly setting. He looked down at the remote before turning off the TV. He tossed the remote to the other side of the couch and was about to stand up. The front door slammed open, and the blond man tumbled in. The man leaned against the doorframe, drunk out of his mind. He cursed under his breath before looking over to Toby. It was his father. Toby jumped slightly and scooted away on the couch. Within an instant, anger was burning inside of him like poison. It was like something took over him. His face contorted in rage, and he quickly snuck over to the kitchen. He was going to grab the knife. Wyan sat in the living room. Her mother was in the kitchen, and her father was in his office. She held the remote in her hand, trying to find something interesting. Bold letters flashed across the screen, causing Wyan to sit up in her seat. Entire neighborhood caught on fire. Family missing. Mass destruction. She looked at the screen. It was in her area. It was close, very close. She recognized that street, and even where the house was. An alarm in her head went off like fireworks. She jumped up, grabbing the gray hoodie and pulling it over her head. "Mom, I'm gonna go out really quick." Wyan said in a rush as she ran outside, not even bothering to turn off the TV. She ran out of the house, getting into her car as fast as she could. The car roared as it started, and Wyan quickly set off, driving down the street haphazardly. As she got closer to the street, smoke clouded the sky, and sirens whirled. People crowded the sidewalk as far as they could go without being pushed back by police. Wyan parked her car in a random driveway, yanking the key from the ignition and getting out quickly. She looked at all the cars and trucks that crowded the house, trying to put out the fire as soon as possible. News reporters stood on the sidelines, recording the chaos as it continued. Wyan pushed her way towards the front, squeezing her way through the crowd. "Excuse me, my friend lives here." She said it loudly, only causing a couple of people to move out of the way. She got up to the front, where it was marked off by yellow police tape. Her heart squeezed as she saw the wreckage of what was once Toby's home. She was tempted to cross the police tape to search for him, but she stayed put. A police officer passed by, and Ryan tried to get his attention. "Were you able to find anyone in the house?" she asked, trying to talk over the crowd. "I'm not allowed to share that information publicly yet," he said, making sure the crowd held back. Ryan's eyes stung with tears. "Please, my friend lives there," she begged, looking desperate for an answer. The police scanned Ryan before sighing. All they found were ashes. Toby's vision blurred together as smoke invaded his lungs. He was losing oxygen, and the mouthguard didn't help. He squinted through the orange goggles, looking at the building as fire licked up the walls around him. He clenched the blood-stained hatchets in his fist tightly as his knees grew weak. He started to grow lighter and lighter until he finally collapsed. In his last moments of the fire, he felt himself being caught by something terribly familiar. He watched as the fire grew more and more distant until he finally passed out. Y'all, this is Chapter 12, Consigned to Oblivion. A decade later, a girl stood in front of Toby. He couldn't hear any of her words, as if they were muffled. It was almost like a memory that was too long ago to remember fully. He felt a sense of familiarity in her presence, so Toby reached out to try and touch her, but the closer he got, the farther she seemed. The girl's face seemed to blend together, not letting him see any recognizable features. It was like she was calling for help. He started to run towards her, only for her to disappear entirely. Toby's face fluttered open to the sterile ceiling. He brought his hand to his face, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. Toby quickly pulled a small sketchbook from his side table and scribbled a sketch of the girl as quickly as he could. Halfway through the drawing, the memory turned to mush, and the dream seemed to blank from his mind. He ran a hand through his hair with a sigh, flipping through pages of previous drawings. They all seemed to be the same person, but each was missing key features of a face. The person's features seemed to be so familiar, yet so distant in his memory, and the name was on the tip of his tongue. Toby carelessly tossed the sketchbook into his nightstand. The small room in his cabin was decorated decently. A few pictures of the forest or wild animals littered the walls. He had a dresser, a bed, and a desk, which was full of random papers and things he collected over the years. Toby yawned and stretched as he waltzed over to the bathroom. He cupped some of the water in his hands, splashing it all over his face, which did little to wake him up. He patted his face dry, looking in the mirror. Dark circles sunk in his eyes, and the scar on his left cheek wasn't getting any better. But that wasn't what he cared about. "I think I need a shave," Toby mumbled, rubbing the scratchy stubble along his jaw. He sighed and set the towel on the side of the sink. "I'll do that later," he thought to himself. A blue navy hoodie sat on top of his dresser, and he gladly pulled it over his scrawly frame. He took a thick, olive-colored coat and pulled it over his shoulders, zipping only about halfway before buttoning up his dirty blue jeans. He took the mouthguard from his pocket, putting it over his face to hide away the demeaning scar. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen of the phone was nearly shattered from how many times he had dropped it in the past. The time was around 5 in the evening. That was a good nap, Toby sighed, tucking his phone in the back of his back pocket. He grabbed his two trusty hatchets from the corner of the room. One was nearly severely old and had a lot of splinters in it, and it's the reason why he wears gloves so often. The other was a little newer and has a metal handle rather than wood. Toby slipped the hatchets into his belt loops, and walked to the front of the cabin. There was a small wood burner, a sofa, a kitchenette, and a TV stand, TV not included. He grabbed a hunting knife from the kitchen counter and put it in his pocket. With one last look around, to make sure he didn't forget anything important, he went outside. Tall pines surrounded the cabin, leaving little space for a front yard. The day had only had only a few wisps of clouds that the sun hid behind. Toby didn't notice that the weather was nice outside due to his inability to feel the temperature. He pulled the nicer hatchet from his belt loop, tossing it in the air and expecting it. It probably needed to be cleaned and sharpened. He started to whistle a tune, which didn't turn out great because of the scar that ran across his cheek. A light breeze drifted through the air, ruffling his unkempt hair. Toby glanced around the area and spotted a popped balloon. He picked up the mangled pieces and put it in his pocket. Why don't people just throw stuff away? He stopped. There was a sound of a group of people conversing, not too far away. The grip on his hatchet tightened. He crouched a bit and slowly crept towards the talking. A group of people, who looked like a family. They were packing up food and decorations. There was an older man, an older woman, a blonde man, and a woman. Toby felt a small click in his brain, almost like he had seen her before. His curiosity gnawed at his bones as he saw the small crowd talking happily to one another. Toby squatted behind a tree, just close enough to hear what they were talking about. I can't believe that it's already the end of the week. We gotta get to the house and start packing, the older man said with a cheery smile. It feels like you guys just got here yesterday, the woman said, putting leftover food in the cooler. Toby was a tiny bit cut off by the woman's voice, like he had recognized it. That is true, but I'm feeling a bit homesick. The older woman laughed jokingly, helping fold a tablecloth. Toby pulled out his phone and pulled up his camera, taking a picture of the woman. He sat behind the tree, looking at the picture with interest. He zoomed in on her face, trying to figure out why he felt so drawn to her. The rumble of a truck started, causing Toby to jump a bit. He looked around the tree to see that the older couple was getting into their truck and leaving soon after. His eyes trailed back to the other couple. The blond man's demeanor immediately switched to a more upset one. You need to hurry up. I don't want to be outside anymore. The man snapped, grabbing a cooler and walking towards a dark blue car. Toby was taken back by the man's rude and hostile behavior. He already didn't like him, whoever he was. The woman sighed and grabbed a bag full of things. Toby leaned forward slightly, taking a small step. His foot snapped on a twig, an obnoxiously loud one, and the woman looked over. Toby's face drained of color, and he quickly stepped out of hiding. Hey, I was just passing through. Need any help? Toby said it quickly, trying not to sound like someone who was just watching them from afar. The woman seemed cautious, looking at Toby warily. No, thank you. We were just leaving, she said, shaking her head. She turned to leave, but she hesitated, looking at Toby. What's your name? She asked. Toby froze, holding his breath. He tried to decide whether to use a fake name or not, but the woman didn't seem dangerous, so. My name's Tobias, he said, outstretching a gloved hand. Wine shifted the bag to hold it with one arm. Her eyes scanned his outfit, landing on his hatches before looking back at his eyes. Toby? She said quietly, not touching his hand quite yet. Toby felt the wind being swept from his lungs. There weren't many people to call him by that nickname. His eyebrows knitted together in confusion. Yes, he said, glancing away slightly before looking back at her. She looked at him in disbelief, but also with a bit of distrust. Toby, as in Toby Rogers? She questioned. Toby froze in panic. Did she recognize him? But how? They only just met. Toby's mind circled, and he slowly let his hand drop to his side. How do you know my name? Toby asked, baffled beyond comprehension. It's me, YN, remember? She said, putting a hand on in her chest. We went to high school together. Oh, God, no. He couldn't remember anything. He barely remembers to pour the cereal before the milk, and she expected him to remember her. Toby looked at her up and down, his mind trying to get any sort of recollection of the past. In the midst of confusion, he thought of something. He looked extremely familiar to the girl he sees in his dreams. If he told her that, she'd run away, thinking he's crazy. I have memory problems, Toby muttered, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. But you seem very familiar. Wine's expression softened, but before she could say another word, the car horn blared in the distance. Wine looked back at the car before turning back to Toby. I wish I could catch up with you, but I have to go, Wine said, seemingly disappointed to leave. Toby blinked, staring at Wyatt long enough to make himself even himself uncomfortable. Wyatt took out her phone and pulled out her contact. Do you have a phone number? Maybe we could talk when I have time, she said in a hurry. Toby looked at the phone before taking it into his hand. He put in his number and handed it back. Wyatt looked back once more before smiling and walking to the car. Toby was left in utter awe as they drove away. He scratched the back of his head. What the fuck just happened? He thought to himself, his mind reeling from the experience. He couldn't believe she knew who he was, or at least who he used to be. Chapter 13. The Girl of My Dreams. Toby looked between the sketchbook and his camera roll as he carefully drew the features onto each face. Each of Wyatt's eyes, the nose, her eyebrows, and her soft lips all fit perfectly. Toby studied the pictures, thinking out loud. I do know her, he muttered, as his shoulders slumped. Something was tugging at the back of his mind, as if he knew exactly who he was, but at the same time, he didn't recognize her. Toby slowly closed the sketchbook, taking his phone into his hand to stare at the image of Wyatt's smile. The feelings that were welled up inside of him were difficult. He felt mostly confused, but he also had a tinge of homesickness. Why can't I remember you? He whispered to himself, zooming in on her face. YN. YN. YN? He huffed, tossing his phone onto his bed carelessly as he rubbing his eyes. He slumped back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. To be fair, he couldn't remember much of it from his past. Ever since the incident, memories have come in blips whenever they are triggered, but he tends to forget them shortly after. With a sigh, his eyes slowly drifted over to the hatches that were propped up in the corner of the room. He watched the light from the warm sunset reflect off of them. Toby got up and grabbed the hatchet, walking outside. He went a little ways from a tree. The tree had some of the bark pulled off and multiple splits in the wood. He raised his arm before chucking the axe with full force. The axe landed directly in the center of the tree. Toby smiled and went to retrieve the axe, pulling it from the trunk with little struggle. A breeze flew over him, and the forest went silent. Every hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Toby's arms dropped to his side, and he glanced around anxiously. Who's there? He shouted, clenching his hatchet. No response. Toby sighed and slowly backed up towards his cabin. He knew exactly who was there. Even after all these years, he still felt the dread of being near it. The door locked, and he crept back to his room, closing the blinds and all the curtains. Toby anxiously waited for any noise or movement. The phone buzzed, causing Toby to nearly jump out of his skin. He leaned over to look at the screen before picking up the phone. Hey, this is YN. I was wondering if you still wanted to meet so we could catch up. I can't believe you're still alive, the message read. Toby stared at the message before tapping on it and replying. Yeah, we can meet up, Toby started. Of course I'm alive. What makes you think I died? Toby thought about sending the message. A few seconds later, the 3 dots appeared on the screen. He watched intently as he waited for another message. We can meet up at the park like we always used to go to. How does tomorrow at noon sound? Toby read the message over twice. Always. He put his hand on his forehead. He must have forgotten a lot more than he thought. Sounds great. Toby turned off his phone with a weird feeling in his stomach. It wasn't butterflies. It was more like moths. Venomous moths. He felt sick, but also nervous. Why was he nervous? He barely knew the woman. Well, maybe he knew the woman before, but that didn't change the fact that he forgot her completely. He looked over the sketchbook, looking at the scratchy drawing of Wyatt once again. Maybe he knew her more than he thought. Wyatt sat on her bed, turning off her phone. She looked over the closet and hurriedly went over to it. A gray hoodie was neatly folded on one of the shelves, and on top of it was a crumpled-looking corsage. A wave of, I don't know how to say that word, emotions washed over her as she pulled the hoodie from the shelf, leaving the corsage in the closet. She hasn't worn the hoodie since the incident, so it still looked nice, but it also looked worn in. She unfolded it and pulled it over her head. The comfort and nostalgia the hoodie brought were immense. After years of trying to forget about one person she actually liked in high school, he was still alive. Wine sighed, reminiscing about the past. Wine pulled her phone from her pocket and set an alarm to wake up early. If she was going to meet up with him, she would have to be quick. She didn't want to be bombarded with questions when she got home. She was about to take off the hoodie when somebody pushed the door open. Toby was relentless. He tossed and turned in her bed, unable to get comfortable in his bed. Sorry, y'all. Toby groaned, punching his pillow and slamming his head back into it. He's still not tired. Toby sat up, looking around his room. He jumped out of the bed and ran to the kitchen. He pulled open an almost empty fridge and yanked the milk carton. He poured himself a glass of milk and chugged it quickly before running back to his bed. Even that didn't make him tired. Toby laid there for a few moments before checking the time. It was 3:38 a.m. Damn it, Toby muttered, staring at the alarm clock on his bedside table. Insomnia was really kicking his ass, and he hated to admit it. Toby just decided to get up and get ready. He trotted to the bathroom and brushed his teeth enthusiastically. He spread some shaving cream along his jaw before carefully shaving away the pokey stubble. He made sure to be extra careful around his scar, but even with the extra bit of careful, he still ended up with a few small cuts. Motherfucker, he mumbled, putting on a few tiny bandages on places he accidentally cut. He washed his face with some water before looking at himself in the mirror. He didn't look half bad. Toby shrugged at his appearance and looked at his hair, which was getting a bit long. He didn't trust himself to not mess up while cutting it himself, so he just tied half of it up with a hair tie. Toby put on a few layers, a t-shirt, a thin jacket, then a bulkier jacket, all to make himself not look as scrawny. He put on his combat boots before looking at his hatchets. Surely he wouldn't need those, but just in case, he put his hunting knife in his back pocket. Toby felt his pockets to make sure he didn't forget anything: phone, knife, mouthguard. His eyes widened, and he looked around quickly for his mouthguard, only to find it on the counter. Toby sighed, putting on his mouthguard to hide that heinous scar. His neck twitched, and he took a deep breath. The reality of what was happening set in. He was about to meet the woman who was in his dreams. It's been a long time since he had a normal interaction with someone other than his inner voices. Toby stepped outside and started to walk through the forest. Just as he started to walk, he realized something. Where the hell am I going? Chapter 14, Shimmery Diamond. Toby walked along the sidewalk, his eyes scanning the park. He prayed that this was the right park because, in all honesty, he had no idea which park Wine was talking about. Toby sat on the benches, tapping his gloved hands on his knees. He wasn't trying to be impatient. He was more anxious, if anything. He checked his phone. 12:10. The park was nearly empty, except for an old-looking taco stand and the few old people walking their little dogs. The sun was directly above them, occasionally peeking out from behind the clouds. He checked the time again. 12:11. Toby was beginning to think that he must have gone to the wrong park or that Wine wasn't actually going to come. He quickly grew hopeless that she wasn't going to meet him there. He checked the message on his phone from the other day, making sure he read it correctly. He was about to stand up before his eyes were covered by two hands. Guess who? The voice spoke, sounding soft and pleasant to his ears. Toby's mind went blank, but he soon regained his composure. Wine? He guessed, looking behind him. He was met with the same soft gaze that he saw the other day, but today she seemed very excited to see him, and he was surprised by that. I know I'm late. It's a hassle trying to get out of my house today, Wyan said lightheartedly as she smiled. She went around the bench, sitting next to him. No, it's okay. I wasn't waiting for that long, Toby replied, glancing away from a moment. His words started to catch up in his throat as his confidence melted into a puddle beneath him. He had no idea what to say or how to have a normal conversation with someone, let alone catch up with someone from however long ago. Wyan looked at Toby, mostly because of what he was wearing and his appearance. Toby looked different, much different, than he did back in high school. At first, Wyan didn't know if it was truly even him, so she decided to ask something. "Could you take off your gloves?" she asked, looking at the black gloves in his hands. Toby looked down at his hands before slowly taking off the gloves. Under the gloves, he had messy bandages that wrapped from his fingers to the middle of his forearm. It really is you, huh?" Wyan remarked, reaching to gently take his hand to look at how badly he had bandaged his arms. Toby's fingers twitched as he forced himself to not pull away from her touch. "Yeah, it's me," Toby said quietly, looking at her face, which was framed by her hair so perfectly. Wyan made eye contact with Toby, making him want to look away. Wyan noticed the mouth guard that was blocking the half of his face from view. She reached out a hand towards his face. Toby quickly grabbed her wrist, preventing her from touching it. When he realized how harshly he had grabbed her arm, he let go. "Sorry," he mumbled, looking away ashamed. "I don't like it off," he explained. Wyan's face turned sympathetic, and she lowered her arm. "Why not?" she asked. Toby gulped. He was cornered. If he didn't show her, he would be hiding something. But if he did show her, she would probably freak the fuck out. Toby put his hand up to his mouth guard, slowly pulling it off his face. Wyan's eyes widened as their eyes landed on a large scar. Her hand went to cover her mouth in shock. "Toby, what happened?" Wyan asked, looking at the rough scarring on his cheek. "I just kind of bit it through," he said with a nervous chuckle, looking away for a bit. Concern was soon brought to his expression, and he looked at Wyan. "Is it bad?" he asked. Wyan shook her head and quickly said, "No, not at all," she said as she tilted her head, looking at the scar from a different angle. "It was just a bit unexpected." Toby nodded, resting his hands on his knees with his fingers intertwined together. The awkward tension was so great that it could have been chopped in half with an axe. Toby cleared his throat. "I think I should just say this." He started taking a deep breath. "I'm not lying to you when I say I can't remember a lot, like amnesia a lot. I mean, I can't even remember you," Toby said, looking at Wyan, who looked confused yet sad. "I mean, I can remember you, but at the same time, I can only see small bits and pieces, to say the least." Toby rambled before Wyan put a hand on his arm, interrupting him. "I think I get it," Wyan said softly, putting her hand back in her lap. Her heart fell, but a tiny little sparkle of hope still held on. "You have no clue who I was, do you?" Toby froze, studying her face. "No," he said in a small voice. "I couldn't even remember your name until yesterday," Toby said, feeling terrible for his lack of remembrance. He shut his eyes, rubbing them as he tried to jog his memory. Wyan put her hand on his cheek, immediately catching his attention. His head snapped over to her as his cheeks started to grow in an embarrassed pink. "What?" Toby mumbled. "I'm trying to help you remember," Wyan said, pressing her hand firmly to his cheek. She smiled and said, "You're actually really warm." A flicker of a memory sparkled in his mind, making Toby's heart jolt. He held Wyan's wrist, keeping it on his cheek as the memory soon faded. "Anything?" she asked. Toby stared off into the distance for a moment, thinking. "A little bit," Toby said, blinking away the deja vu. The corners of his lips twitched into a small smile. "I've never had that strong of a memory," Toby admitted, thinking about the few seconds in the memory over and over. Another thought occurred in his mind. "When was the last time we saw each other?" Toby asked. Wyan thought for a moment. "It has really been a while since I have seen each other." She did a little mental math, fiddling with the ring on her ring finger. Some bitch, she better not be married.
I just wanted to come up in here and let y'all know, keep that in mind as we continue.
10-year-ish, maybe, Wyan said, leaning back in her seat. The breath sweat from Toby's lungs, and his face quickly went back from pink to pale white. 10 years? Toby whispered, looking at the sidewalk. With a little bit of thought, he realized something. He was 28 at least, which almost hurt to say out loud. While Toby was lost in thought, Wyan checked her phone. "Oh my gosh, it's almost 2 o'clock," she said, looking at Toby. Toby came back from his trance, nodding slowly. Would you like to come over to my house for lunch? Wyan offered, putting her phone in her pocket. Toby's face turned to surprise. Well, I wouldn't want to be a bother, he said, shaking his head. No, I insist. It would be awkward to just leave now, Wyan affirmed, standing up, causing Toby to follow in suit. Okay, I guess lunch wouldn't be bad. Toby said it half-jokingly with a hint of nervousness. He put his gloves back on his hands and his mouthguard back over his face. Wyan didn't seem to mind, which made him feel a bit better about it. Wyan drove Toby over to her house. Since Toby didn't have a car, it was a nice thing to do. She was a bit surprised that he didn't have a car at first, but she remembered his Tourette's, which didn't let him drive. Her house was nice and very well maintained. Toby got out of the car, following Wyan inside. The interior of the house was just as nice. The house had comfortable furniture, and it was quite welcoming. I was just going to reheat the leftovers from last night's dinner, if that's okay with you, Wyan said, setting her things down on the dining room table and walking over to the kitchen. Uh-huh, Toby mumbled, his eyes trailing to every last detail of the house as he slowly walked to follow her. Not long after he started snooping, the room was filled with a lingering aroma of food. A craving for whatever was being heated up grew in Toby's mind. He went over to see what Wyan was doing. It was steak and clocked vegetables with a side of a cheesy scalloped potatoes. His mouth watered at the delicious sight of food as he stood with a smile next to Wyan. She looked up at him. You're a lot taller than I remember, Wyan joked, frying up the potatoes in the pan. Toby nodded. I think I grew up a little bit, he commented back, watching her flip the potatoes with a spatula. His eyes couldn't help but wander to her hand, especially the left one. There was a shimmery diamond ring on her ring finger. For some reason, it felt like a stab to the heart. Even if he'd barely remembered her, why would he care? He hasn't seen her in her life for the past 10 years. He looked away at the other things that were scattered around the kitchen, acting like they didn't bother him. The door handle on the front door jiggled before opening, and a blonde man walked into the room. Chapter 15. Her future husband. The door swung open, and a blonde-haired man stumbled in. His clothes were messy, and his hair was just as bad. He looked tired and a bit agitated. The man's eyes looked over at Toby with anger. Who the hell is this Wyan? The man sneered, pointing to Toby as he slowly walked to the kitchen. Wyan's face faltered into fear. She didn't know he would be home so early. Brad, this is Toby. You remember Toby, right? Toby, this is my fiancé, Brad, Wyan said quietly, stepping in front of Toby to avoid any fights between them. Brad's face went from rage to shock, then rage again. Please, no, Toby, as in Ticci Toby? No! Brad said it bitterly. No! What the fuck is he doing? Brad's face went from rage to shock, then rage again. Toby, as in Ticci Toby? Brad said it bitterly. What the fuck is he doing in my house? A small series of memories flickered inside Toby's mind. That little nickname triggered plenty of terrible recalls. Toby's face contorted with anger, and he soon remembered exactly who Brad was. Wyan was about to talk before Toby spoke for himself. I was just visiting, for old time's sake, Toby said calmly while every negative emotion boiled under his skin. He would love nothing more than to slice open Brad's throat and watch him choke on his own blood. But he wouldn't let Wyan bear witness to such a thing. Brad scoffed. So you're cheating on me after all I've done for you? Brad said, glaring at Wyan, who shook her head quickly. I came from work to see you just loving on some other guy? No, that's not what happened. Wyan spoke back. Wyan looked at Brad and back at Toby. She took a container of leftovers and put them in Toby's hands, whispering, you should go. Toby held the warm container in his hands, looking between Wyan and the food. His mind urged him to take the knife from his back pocket, but he resisted and walked to the front door. The tension in the air thickened as he walked past Brad. Toby felt his heavy gaze as he closed the door behind him. Toby stared at the door before hesitantly turning away. Toby started to walk down the side of the road, wishing he would have stayed and defended Wyan. He looked at the sidewalk ahead. It was going to be a long way home. After about an hour of walking, he made it to the forest. The trees were calm and the wind was quiet. The same few thoughts circled through his mind as he made his way back to his cabin. Was Ryan really going to marry that absolute fuckface? Well, he was so angry at her. Maybe if it was just that one time, but what if it wasn't? Toby opened the door of his cabin. The stale air met his nose as he walked inside. His leftovers were already cold, so he took off the lid and put them in the microwave. The resentment towards Brad slowly faded into a warm feeling for YN, a feeling of closeness that was in his heart. As one memory replayed in his mind over and over, her hand was on his cheek, telling him how warm he actually was. Toby smiled softly. Toby took out his phone and opened up messages. She was the only contact he had on his entire phone. But that wasn't very surprising. He had been alone for the last 10 years, and he just found someone who actually was nice to him. He felt a surge of protectiveness towards YN. Sorry about earlier. Are you alright? The text was sent. The microwave beeped, and he took the food out. The smell was just as good as before. Toby didn't hesitate to dig into the meal with a fork, and it tasted even better than it smelled. Toby smiled and continued to eat, all the while staring at the screen for a reply. The reply never came. Ryan locked herself in the bathroom. Loud banging came from behind the door, causing it to rattle on its hinges. Ryan flinched away from it. Ryan, you open this door right fucking now! Brad yelled, slamming the door with his fist. Ryan's face went pale, and she backed away quickly. She looked in the mirror to see that the area around her eye was bright red. She frowned at the realization that it would end up in a black eye in the morning. She slumped against the wall, sitting on the ground. She felt for her phone in her pockets, only to find that it was missing. With a sigh, she leaned her hand on the wall and waited for him to go away. Toby laid wide awake in his bed, staring up at the ceiling. Ryan hasn't replied yet, and Toby couldn't help but be worried sick. The room was deathly quiet, and the only noise was the slight wind outside. The hatches reflected the pale moonlight that shone in the window. His eyes trailed to the handles, then to the axed head. He could just imagine the end of the blade splitting Brad's skull open on the floor. The thought brought a smile to his face. He already killed so many of his bullies from high school over the years. What was one more? Well, this one was different. It was Ryan's fiancée, which angered him to an entirely new level. Toby's screen lit up with a text message. Toby quickly rolled over and snatched the phone off his nightstand. It was nearly midnight, so it had been many hours since he had left Ryan's house. I'm okay, it was just a small fight. Ryan's message read. He knew there was more than she was letting on, and he knew not to push it, but he wanted more answers. Are you sure? He seemed angry, Toby replied. I'm sure he just had a few drinks before he got home, so he was a little irrational. The message said. Toby's expression went flat. Toby knew the exact type of person that Brad was, and it made him furious. Okay, Toby replied, setting his phone on his bed. It was like a dream he had. Ryan called out for help, yet he couldn't get to her. She would go further and further until he could see her. This time, he was going to make sure he could help her. Toby's eyes went back to the hatchets, and he got up. There was no time to waste. He needed to go now before something worse would happen. Y'all, this is chapter 16, Oh, Sweetheart. The night was dark with overcast skies, and the winds were strong. There were only a few luminous street lamps that were in the distance. Toby slowly crept towards Ryan's house, avoiding the light as much as possible. He noticed the garage door was cracked open near the bottom. Lucky for him, he was able to slide easily under it. There was a gray car parked inside, along with plenty of supplies littered around. His eyes caught on a red gas container, which he carried with him. Toby scanned the garage for anything else he could use. He spotted a roll of duct tape, and he slipped it over his wrist. Toby went to the door that led inside the house, setting the gas down. Toby took out his hunting knife and stuck it into the lock, twisting it and turning until he heard a soft click. He slowly turned the handle, creaking the door open quietly. Brad was slumped on the couch, staring at the TV. There were bottles of alcohol spread across the table to accompany his drunken appearance. Toby quietly slipped through the door, leaving the gas can behind. He silently stepped down the hallway, looking at at each door. A few were empty and open: the bathroom, a guest room, and a laundry room. Toby saw a closed door, and he pressed his ear to it. He could hear the sound of a fan inside, so he carefully opened the door. The room was dark. The only light from the TV in the living room gave the space enough dim lighting. There was a nice bed in the middle of the room, pressed against the wall, where 𝐀𝐦𝐬𝐚 laid. She was asleep. Toby shut the door behind him. He slowly walked over to 𝐀𝐻𝐬𝐚 to admire the sleeping beauty in front of him. He reached out a gloved hand and gently brushed away a piece of hair from her features. Her smile vanished within a second. One of 𝐻𝐬𝐚's eyes was surrounded by a large black-purple bruise. He leaned down and whispered, 𝐻𝐬𝐚? Toby whispered, putting a hand on her shoulder to gently shake her. 𝐻𝐻𝐬𝐚's eyes slowly opened. She noticed Toby, and she was confused, but the confusion slowly turned to panic. She pushed herself away from Toby. "What are you doing here?" 𝐻𝐻𝐬𝐚 shouted. Toby shook his head, dismissing. "Shh." He hushed, pulling her towards him forcibly. He pinned her down on the bed, holding a hand over her mouth. He took the duct tape from his wrist and wrapped it around 𝐻𝐻𝐬𝐚's arms and torso. Despite her struggles, she was easily bound by tape due to the multiple layers he used. "You'll be all right, honey," Toby said, cracking a smile. 𝐻𝐻𝐬𝐚's eyes started to tear up in fear and shock. She continued to try and get away, but Toby soon tied up her ankles and thighs to her hands at her sides. Lastly, Toby put a single piece of duct tape over her mouth and tossed away the empty tape roll. He gazed down at 𝐻𝐻𝐬𝐚 without any guilt, even though she was sobbing. Toby caressed her cheek, readjusting her on the bed so she could be comfortable. He planted a soft kiss on her forehead before putting a blanket over her legs. "I'll be right back," he said softly. Toby grinned and pulled up his mouth guard. 𝐻𝐻𝐬𝐚's eyes were wide, and she squirmed, but to no avail of getting away. Toby took one last glance at 𝐻𝐻𝐬𝐚 before leaving her in the room and shutting the door behind him. Toby crept into the living room, sneaking around the couch. He stood directly behind Brad, who had his full concentration on the TV. Toby felt the pent-up aggression slowly building up. He tapped on Brad's shoulder. Brad turned around to see Toby, and he immediately became angry. "What the hell?" Brad was soon cut off by Toby's rough grip around his neck. Brad let out a choked sound as he tried to pry his fingers loose. Toby continued to squeeze harder and harder. Watching Brad's face went from red to purple. Brad tried to speak, but nothing came out except a few gargles and gags. Toby suddenly let go of his neck, causing Brad to gasp for air. But the taste of air didn't last long. Toby grabbed Brad's collar and pulled him over the back of the couch and onto the floor, sweeping the air from his lungs once again. "How does it feel to be desperate for air?" Toby snarled, stomping Brad's chest with the bottom of his boot. Toby's mind flashed with the blood-boiling memories of each and every time Brad had wronged him. The water fountain, the name-calling, the teasing, 𝐻𝐻𝐬𝐚. Brad cried out in pain, not having enough time to have a reaction. Brad's eyes swelled up with tears, and he tried to scoot away, only to be dragged back by his ankles. "You're not leaving this time," Toby said coldly, kicking Brad in the ribs with his steel-toed boots. "I'm sorry." Brad coughed out, attempting to scoot back again, but this time he was weaker. Toby froze, watching as Brad tried to get away. "Sorry." After years of torment, after having the only chance to be normal ripped out of his own hands, after being humiliated by such a bastard, all he gets is a sorry? This angered Toby to no end. Toby tilted his head before walking up to Brad, rather casually before the situation. He grabbed Brad's hair by the roots, lifting his head to meet his gaze. "I can't do this right now." Tisk, tisk, tisk. That's what we're going to do, guys, because I can't do it. Tisk, tisk, tisk. You know, if you had stayed out of it from the beginning, you probably would have lived. Could have lived. Toby said it in a more cocky tone. He clenched Brad's hair harder and threw his head onto the floorboard. Brad yelled in agony and tears, quietly begging for his life. Toby ignored such pitiful pleas and pulled his old, rusty hatchet from his belt. Toby smiled with a slight chuckle. "I don't think you deserve the newer one," Toby remarked, looking at the blade of the hatchet. I think dull and tainted suits you well, hmm? Brad started to stall in panic, the last ounce of adrenaline making him scoot only a few inches. Toby stomped on his shin, keeping him in place. He raised the hatchet in the air with both hands and forced it downward. I could have had a chance. I could have been normal. I could have had 𝐀𝐦𝐬𝐚 a long time ago. Toby twitched as the rush slowly faded. He sighed, wiping away the crimson splatters on his face. He looked down at Brad, whose skull was split directly down the center. Proud of his work, Toby tucked his now bloody hatchet into his belt loop. Toby went to the garage and picked up the gas can. It reeked of the scent of pure gasoline. Perfect. He screwed off the nozzle and poured the liquid all over the house. The beautiful couch, the cozy kitchen, the soft rug, he even poured a little extra on Brad's mutilated corpse. The house was drenched in gas. Well, at least a good amount of it. Toby continued to pour until he made it to the bedroom. The gas eventually ran out, so he tossed it away and opened the bedroom door. 𝐀𝐦𝐬𝐚's gaze was one of pure horror. She cried and tried to scream, only to be muffled by the mask. It was horrifying to see someone covered in so much blood. She couldn't do anything but stare and cry. Toby figured out that would happen, but that didn't bother him much. He knew this was for the best. He took out both of his hatchets and went over to the window, breaking it and destroying it until the opening was wider. Toby took out a box of matches from his back pocket. He struck one against the box and looked at the flame that was brought to life. He tossed the match into the gasoline-soaked carpet in the hallway and shut the door quickly. He looked at 𝐀𝐦𝐬𝐚 and pulled down his mouth guard. "Time to go home, sweetheart," he chimed, lifting 𝐀𝐦𝐬𝐚 up bridal style. 𝐀𝐦𝐬𝐚 let out a cry of distress, and she squirmed as she was carried out the window. It wasn't easy to carry someone as squeamish as her, but he prevailed and made it out of the house safe and sound. 𝐀𝐦𝐬𝐚 continued to sob as she saw the fire spread through her house. The flames engulfed the house hungrily as Toby walked away with her in his arms. He smiled at 𝐀𝐦𝐬𝐚 before looking down at her hand. Toby adjusted her in his arms and gently pulled the glamorous ring from her finger. "You won't be needing this anymore," Toby said before tucking the ring into his back pocket. Chapter 17. Prince Charming. Tears poured from 𝐀𝐦𝐬𝐚's eyes like a waterfall. The more she squirmed, the harder his grip became. Eventually, she decided to relax, though only a tiny bit, and let Toby take her where he wanted, wherever that may be. Her house disappeared out of sight in the night, but she could hear the sirens wail in the distance. Her body was pressed against the blood-splattered clothing of Toby's. It made her want to shrink away in disgust. The metallic smell, the texture, and even look of it were repulsive. Toby eventually shifted 𝐻𝐸𝐚 in his arms to be slung over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes, but her arms were stuck to her sides. The sobs grew tired, and 𝐻𝐸𝐚's eyes eventually became heavy with exhaustion. Toby held onto 𝐻𝐸𝐚's thighs, carrying her around with ease. The walk through the dark town was quick. He didn't want to make 𝐻𝐸𝐚 too shaken up after all, even though he killed her fiancé. The roads were quiet enough to walk on, but without being called out as suspicious. Toby still tried to avoid the light as much as possible. With a decent journey, Toby finally made it to the edge of the woods, a place that felt like home ever since he could remember. He stepped through the tree line and started his walk back to his cabin. He wasn't sure if 𝐻𝐸𝐚 was passed out or if she simply fell asleep. He wouldn't have minded either way. It just made her easier to carry. Clouds didn't let much of the moonlight shine through, though, which was slightly disappointing. He was hoping for the whole thing to be a little more romantic and less creepy. To Toby, he was Prince Charming, saving the princess from the evil king. Toby could only wish that 𝐻𝐸𝐚 would see him that way. He did all the dirty work for her, after all. Without his help, she would have been married to that ugly pig. 𝐻𝐸𝐚's eyes slowly fluttered open to see her vision surrounded by trees. She looked from side to side, trying to figure out where she was. The only thing familiar was Toby, who had her on his shoulder. The tape was starting to itch at her skin and lips. She tried moving her face to get the tape to budge, but nothing helped her. She wiggled a little in his arms, feeling uncomfortable in his confident grip. "Oh, you're awake," Toby voiced, patting her leg as he continued his way home. "I was starting to get a little worried there," he half joked. To- Wine was muffled by the tape, but if she were to say something, it would probably sound like, "You're crazy," or "What the hell, let me go." Wine's muffled speech only served to fuel a little bit of Toby's laughter. Toby held Wine tighter and took her off his shoulder. He generally leaned her against the tree, but Wine felt like she had pins and needles in her feet from being held for so long. Toby gently peeled the tape off of her mouth. "What did you do?" Wine gasped for air, leaning more into the tree than closer to Toby. "Well, I expected a thank you, but I thought what I did was quite obvious." Toby smirked, pulling his mouth guard to hang loosely around his neck. Same with his goggles. "Thank you?" Wine was questioned in disbelief, finding the expectation to be rather outrageous. "You're welcome." Toby grinned playfully as he hoisted Wyan right back onto his shoulder. "What? No, that's not what I meant," Wyan said, trying to get out of Toby's hands. His strong, rough hands. "Oh, yeah?" Toby raised an eyebrow, continuing his walk. "Why should I thank you for murdering my fiancé? Not to mention you burned my house, then you kidnapped me," Wyan said, kicking her legs. Toby wrapped his arms around her thighs, forcing them to stay still. "I mean, Brad was a complete dick anyway," Toby frowned, "and I had to burn the house before the police could find his body." He glossed over the fact that he was indeed kidnapping her. It was just a word that didn't roll off the tongue well in his mind. Wyan went limp on his shoulder with a defeated sigh. "That house costed so much money," Wyan said, on the verge of tears. Toby's eyes flickered over to Wyan. Hey, don't cry about that now. I'm bringing you home," Toby assured, stepping over a fallen log. Wyan perked up slightly. Wait, you're taking me back to my house?" she said with a pinch of hope. "Oh, not your home. My home, which is going to be your home, too." Toby chuckled, his cheeks flushing with a soft pink hue. Wyan's face immediately fell back into the pit of fear. "What if I don't want to?" she responded quickly, turning her head to look at him. "You really don't have much of a choice." The cabin soon came into view. There was a dim porch light next to the door, which was off. A chimney protruded from the metal roof, and a few windows decorated the walls. Wyan gazed upon the cabin. Her mind racked up ideas of the worst possible thing lying behind the door. Toby turned the doorknob and went inside. Wyan braced herself, only to be met with a cozy interior, though it was a little bit dusty. Wyan relaxed at the lack of immediate danger and looked around the furniture. It was nice, almost too nice for a murderer. That realization clicked with her, too. Her old friend was a murderer. He burned her house down and kidnapped her, which was the cherry on top. Wyan plopped Wyan down on the sofa. He pulled out a hunting knife out of his pocket, making Wyan's stomach fall. "What are you planning on doing with me?" she asked in a wavering tone. "I was going to get you out of this tape," he said, sawing the thick layer of tape and peeling it off piece by piece. Wyan's arms were free, and it felt nice to stretch, but she figured it would be smart not to try to escape the person with the weapon. Wyan stayed quiet in too much shock over what was happening. She stretched out her arms, pushing away the soreness in her bones. Toby hummed to himself and walked over to the freezer. Wyan expected him to pull out someone's decapitated head at this point, but all he did was get an ice pack. Toby pressed the ice pack against Wyan's soon-to-be black eye. "It will help with the swelling," he said, letting Wyan take hold to her eye herself. The ice pack was very cold, but it felt soothing to the soreness. "Why are you doing all of this?" Wyan asked, feeling left in the dark about Toby's intentions. Toby's eyes widened at the question, and he sits down next to her, rubbing his jaw. "To make this long story short, I love you." Chapter 18. Love? Wyan's eyes widened with shock as she tried to comprehend his words. Love. Love? What was this? What about this was love? She pressed the ice pack firmly to her eye, a pit starting to form in her stomach. I don't know what to say, Wyan muttered, crossing her free arm over her lap. Toby's lips pursed together, and he ran a hand through his hair with a heavy sigh. I think that's fair. I guess that's fair, he started. But let me explain to you before you call me crazy, he said, standing up in front of Wyan. She nodded, gesturing for him to keep talking. Toby took a deep breath. So recently, I've been seeing memories of you. And I know technically I forgot who you were for a few days ago, but I remembered you when I used to like you. I liked you. A lot. Toby smiled, proud to get through an explanation with minimal stutters. Wyan stared with an expression of subtle fright. It's been 10 years since then, Toby, Wyan softly said, taking the ice pack off of her eye for a moment to rest on a bruise on her arm. Toby shook his head. And? Toby questioned, raising an eyebrow. He put his hands on his hips, tilting his head. And I have a different life now, Wyan said, feeling the sting of tears threaten to break through. I guess I should say that. I should say had. Toby frowned before quickly shaking off what she said. You'll be fine here. I can take care of you and protect you. Just like I should have a long time ago, Toby said with more firmness in his voice now. Toby, you quite literally set my life on fire, Wyan retorted, trying not to sound angry. She set the ice pack back on her eye. Toby grimaced. It was for a good reason. Brad was a real shithead, he said, gesturing while speaking, like he was talking with his hands. I was going to marry him, Wyan replied quickly, her expression growing frustrated. Toby scoffed, crossing his arms. Well, not anymore. I fucking murdered his bitch ass, and I'd do it again. Toby blurted, gritting his teeth. He couldn't understand why Wyan was so ungrateful. He saved her. She should have been begging to stay with him, but for some reason, she didn't. Toby looked back down at Wyan with an annoyed expression, but the expression extremely quickly faltered when he saw Wyan's eyes. Tears ran down her cheeks like a crystal stream on a spring day. Her shaky hand wiped out her face as she sniffled back sobs. Oh God, maybe he was a bad guy. Panic wrapped around Toby's heart, and he sat next to Wyan once again. Wyan scooted a bit away, prompting him to scoot a few inches closer. Toby curled his arms around Wyan, making her tense up a bit as he pulled her towards his body. Toby was so awful at comforting people. He rested his head on top of Wyan's, his cheek pressed against her hair. He couldn't help but get sidetracked by the faint smell of her shampoo. The sweet scent was mixed with the smell of blood and smoke, serving as a reminder of the heinous act he committed. He was tempted to say something. To talk to her, to rock her side to side, to kiss her on the cheek, to tell her everything was all right, but it would be too soon. So he sat there awkwardly, holding her against him in some pathetic attempt at comfort. If you want, you can shower, he said in a gentle tone. Toby was trying to get rid of that awkward silence that lingered in the air. He got up and pointed to the bathroom, his arms falling back to his sides. You can use whatever you want in there. Wyan wiped her eye, putting the ice pack to the side. With a simple nod, she stood up, walking over to the bathroom. She looked back at Toby warily, her mind shuffling through all the terrible things that could happen. What are you going to do? She asked, with her hand on the door. Toby glanced around the cabinet, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. Wait for you to be done, I guess. He shrugged, struggling to make eye contact in such an odd, tension-filled moment. Wyan sighed in response. Okay, she mumbled, walking into the bathroom. She locked the door behind her, locking it for good measure. The bathroom had a few things in it, but it was all obvious Toby lived here. All-in-one shampoo, conditioner, body wash, a toothbrush, and toothpaste. Oh my God, not the all-in-one. Half-empty mouthwash, cologne, and an empty container of hand soap. Wyan looked around the bleak bathroom before looking at the shower. It would feel nice to get these dirty clothes that were covered in her ex-fiancé's blood off of her. Eventually, she caved in and peeled her clothes off, hopping in the shower. Toby stood in the living room. He could hear the shower running in the other room, and he felt grateful that she wasn't stalling in there just to avoid him. Toby tucked his hands in his pockets before realizing that he was too covered in blood. His eyes widened. An unamused came from his lips. Maybe that's why she was so scared of him in the first place. Toby looked at his clothes, zoning out for a bit before he remembered something utterly random. 𝐀𝐻𝐬𝐚's car. He looked at the front door and the bathroom door. Toby knew he wasn't allowed to drive because of his Tourette's, but just maybe. He stepped towards the door before going outside. It took a while to get to her house, but if he ran, he would make it there and back quickly. He bolted out the door, shutting it behind him as he ran. Surely he would be back in time. Or where is it? As Toby came closer to 𝐀𝐻𝐬𝐚's old neighborhood, he slowed to a fast walk. The smoky state in the air was still present, and making Toby cough a bit. He turned the corner to see the remains of 𝐀𝐻𝐬𝐚's house. Only a few things survived in the heat of the fire: the car, the metal pipes, and police tape. Wait, police tape? Toby looked at the police tape that surrounded the house. No one was there, and there wasn't a car in sight. Perhaps they put out the fire and saved the rest of the work for tomorrow? Toby pulled his hoodie over his head, followed by his mask and goggles. If there were remaining police, he didn't want to be recognized or known as a suspect. Toby peered around before creeping up to the burn site. Everything was charred, from the front entrance to the back of the house. Toby hunched over, trying his best not to be seen while walking in the place 𝐻𝐻𝐬𝐚 once called home. He looked around at the floor, seeing the spot where he had chopped Brad into little pieces. The body was gone. Toby gulped, hoping that the fire got to the body before any police could. He snuck over to 𝐻𝐻𝐬𝐚's old room, looking around to find the damaged metal frame and a safe. Ooh, Toby cooed, picking at the crispy safe and shaking it a bit. He could hear something inside, but it didn't clatter around. He tilted his head before tucking it under his arm, rather surprised that the police hadn't confiscated it yet. Toby's eyes went back to the car, and he hurried over to it. He peered inside to see the car keys in the cup holder. He opened the door and got into the driver's seat, hoisting the safe into the passenger side. He savored the feeling of pride as he sat in the driver's seat, wishing in the back of his mind that he could drive legally. Toby shrugged it off and decided he would check off auto theft on his bucket list. The keys slid into ignition. Controlling the damn thing was a wild experience for Toby. The pedals were very sensitive to touch, and he didn't hesitate to go fast and get out of there quickly. He drove through the police tape, which enticed a chuckle from him. There was no denial of the thrill of breaking the law, but this was totally different. He was just taking the car and illegally driving it back to where he kidnapped 𝐻𝐻𝐬𝐚, and there was nothing wrong with that. Chapter 19, The Rogers Case. Toby creaked the door open with the safe tucked under one arm. He wanted to open it himself, but he wondered if he could get the password from 𝐻𝐻𝐬𝐚 before he tried to pry it open. He looked inside the cabin to see that the lights were off. A hint of worry entered his expression, and he set the safe on the kitchen counter. He went to the back of his cabin, towards his room, to see where 𝐻𝐻𝐬𝐚 was hiding. She wasn't hiding at all. In fact, she was sleeping under the heavy quilt on his bed. Toby froze at the sight, not sure if she was actually sleeping. He didn't blame her for sleeping after such a long trip here, but he was also surprised that she was able to sleep after he abducted her. Toby tilted his head, his eyes wandering to her clothes. She wasn't wearing the things she had on before she got here. She was wearing his clothes. A faint blush crept up his neck as he resisted the urge to see what she was fully wearing. From what he could see, she was in one of his old band tees. Toby hasn't worn that shirt in a few years, and he was surprised that she was able to find it. Toby stood in the doorway, his shadow cast on the bed from the light in the other room. There was a temptation to stay there and watch her rest, which he was able to fight off. Toby locked the front door with his house key and tucked it into his jean pocket. With a sigh, He took a comfortable change of clothes, basketball shorts and a large shirt. He set them on the edge of the bed and went to the bathroom to shower. His mind went to a different thought. Toby hasn't showered in... Actually, he can't remember the last time he showered. Oh. He peeled off his clothes, which smelled bad from the dried blood and dirt that covered them, and got into the shower. The shower was small, but he didn't mind. It kept him from staying in there for too long that he's ever been in the shower for... Okay, anyways. After washing his hair and the parts of his body that were particularly smelly, he dried it off with a towel. Toby could see the steam that rose off his body. He didn't necessarily feel any warmer. He did feel a hell of a lot cleaner, though. It almost felt like he washed off an entire layer of his skin. Toby wrapped the towel around his waist and went to reach for his clothes. The counter next to the sink was empty. He blinked. What did I do? Toby surely cut himself off when he remembered that the clothes were on the end of the bed. Toby cracked the door open, and there they were, nicely folded on the edge of the bed. Toby groaned out in frustration eternally and opened the door slightly more. Wine was still sleeping. He prayed that Wine was a deep sleeper and that she wouldn't realize that he was almost naked as he tiptoed out the door. He reached his arm out and successfully grabbed the pile of clothes with one hand holding his towel up. The floorboard under Toby creaked under the pressure, and his eyes shot open. Wine rolled over on the bed, laying on her other side. Toby froze, waiting for her to stop tossing and turning. His hands clenched around the clothes, and he brought them to his chest, taking them inside the bathroom. Toby softly closed and locked the door. The mirror reflected his red face back to him, and he was a bit surprised at how red he was. That could have gone terribly, but it didn't. So that was a good sign, right? Toby put on his clothes and went over to the other side of the bed. Coincidentally, it was the side that he slept on every night. The side where Toby shaped dent in the mattress. Toby laid on it with a sigh, converting himself with the quilt. His eyes traveled over to YN, and despite his insomnia, his eyes started to grow heavy. Are you trying to tell me that we have no evidence of what could have caused the fire? Toby McKinney said, crouching under the police tape. No, everything was destroyed in the fire. There was only ash and rubble. Detective Doherty said, following McKee as they went to the remains of the singed house. And the people who had lived there? Officer McKee added, looking around the destruction for anything. Gone. We have no clue if they died or disappeared. Detective Jardin shrugged, crossing his arms. McKinney put a hand on her holster. It doesn't make any sense. We've had so many instances like this in the past. They are all here in Denver, McKinney said, shaking her head in disbelief as her boots crunched under the crispy floor. Yeah, I know. Detective Jardy replied, the same type of spontaneous fires and missing people cases for the past 10 years. Jardin furrowed his eyebrows. Officer McKinney looked over to the other group of officers. Excuse me for a moment, she said, walking over to them. Jardin nodded, putting his hand in his pockets. He cursed under his breath, rubbing his jaw in thought. Detective Jardin thought back to the first arson-related case he's tried to figure out, the Rogers case. It was pushed off as a simple house fire and dismissed, even though there were missing people. Rogers. He muttered under his breath, opening the notes app on his phone and writing something down. He was just about done with these disappearances. Later that night, Detective Jardin was sitting at his computer. He stared at some of the things he wrote on the pad of paper. The same damn case, but who? Who would have committed such a crime? The detective looked up the records of the Rogers household, skimming the results. 2 adults, 2 children. The daughter, Lyra Rogers, unfortunately died in a car accident. The son, Tobias Rogers, fortunately survived, blah, blah, blah. Detective Jardin sighed and leaned back in his seat, twirling a pen in his hand. The night was getting darker. In fact, it was almost midnight, and he should have been heading home by now, but he was more than determined to find something, anything. His eyes landed on one line of the report. Tobias Rogers was institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital on multiple occasions. Detective Jarden's eyebrows raised, and he sat up, scooting his chair closer to his desk. He searched up a more detailed file on the boy. Turns out that Tobias had plenty of disorders to go around. He clicked on the image of the boy, rather thin and young. Probably the case was 10 years old. Jarden crossed his arms and tapped his pen on his chin as he read the text. Missing. He ripped the top page of notes out of his notepad of paper and started fresh. Writing at the speed he was, it looked like a 3-year-old wrote it, but he could read it just fine. Detective Jarden searched up something else regarding the Rogers household. He was going to solve this case, no matter the cost. Oh, my Lord, baby Jesus, y'all. A whole bunch of emotions everywhere going through. I'm telling y'all, I had to take a hot moment to not read and to kind of vent out my frustrations. Not how it's written or anything. It's just how the story oh, I wish this happened instead of this. How dare they, stuff like that, little pettiness against certain things, right? How dare he not go back, stuff like that, y'all. You get so into a story, you're oh shit, I need to back away, I need to relax type shit. So that's what happened with me in this. Now there may be 1 or 2 detectives that may potentially start banging on Toby's tail sooner than later. And we shall find out in the next futuristic video, y'all. It is 1:16 a.m. right now. Literally, bah. Oh, Lord, y'all. But I just had to read this for y'all guys, because you know what? The story is super good, and I was dying to get it, get myself updated with it too. Can't believe the amount of chapters we read, but honestly, y'all, no regrets at all. What do you think is gonna happen next, guys? Comment them in the comments down below. Do you think that these detectives are gonna be able to figure out that it was Toby, or will they dismiss it as something else? Let me know in the comments down below, guys. Honestly, IDK, no idea. We will find out soon, y'all. We will find out soon. We will get to the bottom of this mystery in the next futuristic video, y'all. I hope you guys did enjoy this, though. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more amazing videos, guys. Thank you so much for staying tuned in with the story. I know it's hard. It's been a month since I posted the first one, but I was sick, so I'm so sorry, y'all. But promise I'm gonna be posting more often now that I feel 10 times X better, y'all. Period. Anyways, sadly, your girl's gotta go. Bye and peace, y'all, and happy holidays.